meeting of March 27th. Call upon the secretary to have the roll call.
Private members, Mr. Michael Spitzer, Chair.
Present.
Mr. Bud Larson.
Present.
Public members, representing Mayor Bill de Blasio, Mr. John Grathwell.
Present.
Representing Comptroller Scott Stringer, Ms. Jacqueline Thompson. Present. We have a quorum.
Thank you. A motion to accept the minutes,
So moved.
which I didn't get. They weren't in my package. Okay. The first order of business is the Mayor's Fund to Advance New York City. Would you like to introduce yourself and everybody that's here with you?
Sure. Good morning. My name is Toya Williford. I'm the Executive Director of the Mayor's Fund to Advance New York City. And I am joined by Jen Katz, our auditor from RSM. I'm also joined by Fred Beglia, our Director of Finance and Operations, as well as Chris Kelsa, our Finance Manager. And we're delighted to be here today. Thank you. So the Mayor's Fund is a 25-year-old nonprofit. We were created by former Mayor Rudolph Giuliani to facilitate innovative public-private partnerships. We work with over 30 city agencies and mayoral offices. We have over 300 institutional funders, and those can be philanthropic organizations, corporate donors, individual donors, and we have over 100 community-based providers that we partner with to deliver essential city services. The Mayor's Fund is chaired by the First Lady, Shirlane McCrae, and we're governed by a board of directors appointed by the mayor. We currently have 7 board members. In addition, the Mayor's Fund has an advisory board comprised of prominent civic and business leaders appointed by the mayor, and these individuals help advise our programming and provide operational support. We currently have 54 members on our board of advisors. The fund also has an audit committee consisting of 3 directors as per our bylaws, and we meet twice a year. In those meetings, we generally approve a scope of work for the audit, and then we also meet to review and approve the audit findings and present that to the full board. The board meets annually 3 times a year. We're located at 253 Broadway, and the space is an in-kind donation from the city. So I'll talk a little bit about our programs and the partnerships we've facilitated over the past 25 years. So starting in some of the key programs from prior administration, so just so you can understand historical context, with Mayor Giuliani, we facilitated a lot of the donations around the 9/11 fund. That was a major initiative that we had. Under former Mayor Bloomberg, had to think about that. Under former Mayor Bloomberg, we facilitated many programs, Million Trees, the Young Men's Initiative, Housing Help. We actually created and launched the first Family Justice Center. We now have 5 throughout the borough, and these are in coordination to support victims of domestic violence. Under Mayor de Blasio, we have launched the Center for Youth Employment. That was in 2015. That entity coordinates with the Department of Youth and Community Development. We raise funds for the Summer Youth Employment Program. We support Ladders for Leaders. We also support internships for vulnerable youth. We have also, working in partnership with the Office of Strategic Partnerships, launched Building Healthy Communities, and that's an initiative that promotes safe communities, a healthy lifestyle through exercise, as well as nutritional benefits. And so under that initiative, we have the New York City Soccer Program, where we are building 50 soccer pitches and providing 10,000 after-school opportunities for young people. We are also working with Green City Force around the Farms at NYCHA project. As you may know, there are 6 urban farms throughout the city. It's an AmeriCorps program that employs young people living in NYCHA, provides them with skills, helps them get through high school, and eventually onto post-secondary success. In addition to those programs, we most recently partnered with Health and Hospitals. We got a $1.5 million donation from the Lori Tisch Illumination Fund to support the Arts in Medicine program, and that's a program within our public health system, the largest in the country, to support our arts and healing program throughout their 70 locations. So as I said before, we work with over 30 agencies and mayoral offices. We provide a variety of services, all with the goal of serving vulnerable New Yorkers. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer questions about our partnerships with agencies, how we raise, identify, invest, manage those private dollars that then pair with public dollars for the benefit of vulnerable New Yorkers, or any other questions you might have about the work we do in coordination with the City of New York.
Thank you. Some of the comments and questions I might have, one of our colleagues who couldn't be here today forwarded his questions to me. And everybody's going to laugh. The first one is, you should be capitalizing "the" for the City of New York.
That is a grammatical debate that we have in my office all the time. I will let folks know.
And you could find out from the secretary who that person is if they need to talk to him. But on page 13, you state mutual funds are not subject to custodial credit risk because their existence is not evidenced by securities that exist in physical or book entry form.
Yeah, so that's actually language that's extracted from GASB 40 that explains for mutual funds that they don't have to be disclosed for custodial credit risk.
Okay. On page 16, the amount of monies that are held in the bank, you're saying was uninsured and uncollateralized. Why not?
I can turn to Fred or Jen to respond to those specific questions from the audit.
We're not required to insure or collateralize the funds. You mean the ones from?
There's $1.5 million sitting there.
Above the 250, and you're suggesting that we take measures
Collateralize
to, yeah. Well, that's something we could definitely take into consideration.
Okay. Further down on that page, yet there was a report from the OIG about $4.6 million potential disallowance. And the question I have is that included in the city's calculation for the disallowance?
So I can actually speak to some resolution. That audit has been concluded as of March 11th of this year. The actual disallowance came out to be, let me get the exact number, $212,703. I think from the language that you're speaking of, we strongly disagreed with the vast majority, and it came out to $212,703.
You know, my initial, like, I'm very familiar with the disallowances, and the city has a whole model.
Yeah.
That on the city's financial statements, we project what those disallowances might be. My question was the 4.6 as part of that? And because you're saying now $212,000 will have to be paid back, or you're going to have to come up with funds to supplement the program.
We have an answer. Mr. Spitzer, it's not included in the calculation, although we did pay it out of the disallowance reserve because the city, under the contract with Mayor's Fund, indemnified them for disallowances.
Well, that statement's there. That's specifically why I asked, was it part of the calculation? Okay. Anybody else have any questions?
Did folks want to hear a summary from Fred or Jen about just an overview of the finances?
Sure.
So, good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to present. Our total revenue for FY18 was $21,338,841. It's about 2.5 less than our previous fiscal year, which is historically not a significant difference because from year to year, the total revenue can vary quite a bit from the Mayor's Fund depending on the type of programming, because our portfolio changes quite a big difference from year to year, depending on the cities and programming needs. Our operating expenses for FY18 were $20,754,230. This is 14.5% less than the previous fiscal year, and it's primarily due to the Operation AmeriCorps program, which is part of our NYC service program. This had come to a close at the beginning of FY18, so there was significantly less expenses. I feel here I should mention that our 2017 figures were restated. For several revenue and expense items, information was received well after the conclusion of our 2017 audit, and it was later determined that they were best represented in that year, thus requiring restated figures. The total amount being of $527K. And so one of the reasons why this happens is we receive contributions that support single-year and multi-year programs. So the timing of program revenue and expenses are influenced by program budgets. In some cases, revenue and expenses occur in different fiscal periods, and we're working with 30-plus agencies. So some of it is dependent on timing when we get that information from all the agencies that we work with, and it's unfortunate that it happens, but it does happen, and it's kind of plagued the Mayor's Fund. As a result, we've instituted, at the suggestion from RSM, a quarterly reconciliation process that Chris and I go through now, where we reconcile quarterly revenue expense with all our agency partners, and thus far it's proven to be pretty helpful. Let me see. Just a word about our composition of revenue in general. It may be helpful to know what our revenue looks like. 20% of our revenue comes from corporate, 55% is foundation, 23% of it is government, and our individual is 2%. Our net position had a modest increase for FY18 of almost $1 million. We were at $13,573,139 at the beginning of the year, and it rose to $14,559,382. And our investments, we have mutual funds, which is it's in a short duration bond fund. And this is where a lot of our restricted programming funds sort of sit in a kind of like a savings, where we hold them. They earn a little bit of dividends that we can use as unrestricted funds to pay for operations cost. When we need to replenish our program accounts in Chase, in the accounts, we move it over. But it's rare because that account is frequently being replenished. And you may want to know a little bit about our investment strategy. So our bylaws don't actually require board approval to approve any specific strategy changes or anything like that. But as an order of best practice, senior staff and the board sort of get together and convene with our portfolio manager, and I would say maybe at least once a year, to discuss the current market conditions and make any changes necessary with the current portfolio. But it's very much in a preserve principle, and it doesn't earn a whole lot of money, but it's in a very safe place. So, as you can imagine, with restricted programming. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about what I said or anything else here.
Is there certain restrictions on what you can invest in?
Yes.
Yeah.
There are
Yeah.
the investment guidelines, so we also do have a separate report regarding investment compliance. So the one investment is permitted under their guidelines.
Are there any other questions? Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having us. We appreciate the time.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
What? Are you my show?
He started the thing and he probably raised a lot of money like I did for special projects.
I'm fine, thank you.
Yeah, tax lien folks. Yeah, I can. Is Alan coming back? Okay. Come back. Yeah, we also need our chairman, so there's that.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Would you like to introduce yourselves and everybody on your team?
Okay, Alan Andrews, I'm from New York City OMB, Deputy Director.
Jay Olson, Assistant Director at OMB, and we also have from LaPerk, Tom Gallagher, the Program Manager, Brent Jensen from Tosky, who's our auditor, and Sibby Thomas from Marks Paneth, who compiles the financial statements. I believe before we get going, there's required communication to this audit committee from our auditor.
Sure. In regards to all of the trust financial statements, I'm just going to start off by saying that these are all clean, unmodified opinions, no significant deficiencies, no material weaknesses, nothing that would be of concern to this committee. In terms of required communications, in all of these statements, the accounting policies are in note 2 to the financial statements. It's important to note there's nothing we consider to lack authoritative guidance, meaning nothing that we felt was inconsistent with guidance given, nothing we felt was incomplete in terms of policies. In terms of significant estimates, there was the allowance and collectability of the receivables, and all of these is really the most significant item and estimate within the financial statements. There were no difficulties, uncorrected or corrected misstatements or disagreements with management to report. A rep letter was provided as of the opinion date of these financial statements for each one of them, and there was no consultation with other accountants in terms of opinion-seeking type items. You worked with, obviously, Marks Paneth, you worked with us, you worked with Tom to get all the information together and get it properly audited, but there's nothing where you were going looking for another opinion or anything that we had to report. So I think that pretty much takes care of the required communications across all of these.
Thanks. Did you have any comments?
No,
Should
go
I-
ahead.
Okay, well, just I know I want to respect everyone's time here. We need to be brief. A lot of familiar faces, as we know that these trusts collectively form a enforcement mechanism for property taxes and water and sewer fees. And, the process goes every year. There are multiple trusts because there's one set up for each year of, collections that needs to be done. And as bonds are issued and roll off, the trusts are then consolidated to the 98-2. I could probably stop there unless, Alan, you have anything else and go into your questions.
Well, just take your questions.
On page 5
Of which one?
of 98-2.
So 98-2 is the, what we call the graveyard, the final resting place for a lot of these liens. Page 5, you say?
Yeah, basically, it says the increase in tax liens receivable resulted from a decrease. And, you know, like, it's a very large number. It's right below the schedule. So, you know, basically, you reduce the doubtful accounts by almost $22 million.
Right. Well, what happens is, and some of the larger legacy liens, problematic properties that have been in the trust, as they get resolved, there's no allowance to take against, there's no allowance to take against those larger liens that have been basically liquidated. So you have a large receivable balance and then a large write-off balance, you know, or a reserve. And then when you actually resolve that lien and it actually goes to cash, that kind of reserve against that balance goes away. So basically what you're going to see over the next, I would say, 2 to 3 years is I would predict that the actual reserve is, overall is going to go down as those older liens that have these large generated balances that are not collectible, when they finally get resolved, the reserve is actually going to go down.
Is that because of the way this was done in the past? As we proceed forward, will this be less of an issue?
Well, I think in the earlier years of the program, we sold a lot more distressed liens. So some of that is just kind of getting through that backlog. The city has, in more recent years, also decided to sell some distressed liens that were on their books. So I think this is going to be sort of an oscillating pattern where you'll get some buildup in receivables and reserves, and then they'll kind of melt away. And then if the city sells some new additional distressed collateral, it'll slightly build. But I don't think you'll see it get to the heights that it is now. I think we're going to kind of continually trend downward on this. But it will fluctuate. It won't be a straight line sort of, or a sort of straight plane reduction in that reserve.
But probably going forward, the volume of distressed liens won't be as significant as it was in the past.
I think that's correct.
Is the resolution of the distressed liens characterized principally by writing off, or is there some underlying other positive resolution that occasionally happens?
So the real goal of enforcing against distressed liens is just getting the property into more productive hands. So even though the financial benefit to the city in terms of cash may be reduced or may be minimal, it will actually allow the property to be in more productive hands, because these liens just sit as a sort of cloud on title, right? When you have a large tax balance on a piece of property, it basically, the property is trapped, right? You can't really, a developer can't go in, you can't mortgage the property, you can't really invest in the property. So we view this as one of the sort of what I'll call ancillary benefits of the trust, is just sort of clearing these old distressed properties and getting them sort of a new chance on productive use.
I have a number of nits from Mark, including the capital T. So I'll give them all to Raymond at the, you know.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
The next is Alan again for water and sewer.
Actually, we're going to bring the Water Authority team up.
This along for his 45 minutes. John, trying to move this along because it's 45 minutes.
Hitting a couple of high
What time
points.
the hot dog come?
Yeah.
So I have the onerous task of introducing the people who are actually going to make the presentation, which is Olga Chernat, our executive director, and Joe Murin from DEP. And as to the auditor, I'll have you.
So I was wondering if, so we're going to, I think most of the folks here that's sitting on the table are representing the bond financing entity, so I'm going to just introduce everybody now. And then what we plan to do is give the financial highlights for each one of the bond financing entities. We have a general presentation that we'd like to give to you on an update on the Hudson Yards project, and then we'd like to turn it back over for questions on the financial statements. My name is Rob Balducci. I actually am the controller for New York City Water System, Transitional Finance Authority, Hudson Yards Infrastructure Corporation, TSAS Inc., STAR, and FSC. And to the right of me is Alan Anders, who's has different titles here. He's the Chief Executive Officer for the New York City Municipal Water Finance Authority. He's the Executive Director of TFA, and he's the President of all the rest of the entities. Olga, who's sitting next to Alan to the right, is the Executive Director of the New York City Municipal Water Finance Authority, and we have Joe, which I know everyone who knows Joe, so there's one over, and he's the executive of the Water Board. Jay Olson is at the end, and he's our treasurer for STAR, HYC, FSC, TSAS, and FSC. Our auditors is Mark Spaneth, and we have our partner Warren Rupel. He was the auditor on the New York Water System, HYIC, FSC, TSAS, and I think I got, and FSC if I didn't say that. And I have Brent Jensen, and is Brent here? He is our auditor on STAR. Let me just make sure he's here.
Somebody's coming up.
He's coming up, okay, and he was just sitting, he just was sitting here a little while ago on tax lien trust. With that, we'd like to go through the financial highlights of these entities, and starting with the New York Water System, and I'm going to turn that over to Olga Chernat.
And I might suggest, after all of our careful presentation of how we're going to do this, basically the water group really isn't involved in the other presentations, so it might be useful to go through the presentation, and if you've got questions on those financials, to do that all at once. Right. That group can leave, and then all the rest of the entities are the same people.
It's a good idea.
Sounds good. Good morning, all. I will walk you through the highlights of the New York City Municipal Water Finance Authority operations in fiscal 2018. Consistent with our mission to finance capital needs of the New York City water and sewer system, the authority issued $2.9 billion of bonds, of which $1.4 billion was used for refunding purposes. We reimbursed the city for $1.6 billion of capital projects costs. We legally defeased approximately $769 million of outstanding bonds using current revenues. Total revenue for the system, which includes operating revenue and non-operating revenue, was $3.9 billion, and operation and maintenance expense was $1.4 billion. Interest expense, $1.2 billion, and we retired $397 million of outstanding bonds due to natural maturity of the bonds. So these are the highlights. I understand you want this to be in a brief format, so I guess we can open it to Q&A. And again, we have representatives of DEP as well as the authority and auditors.
I guess on page 10, deferred outflows of resources from hedging. What is being hedged?
So we're going to use this one because they have the
that's a
cap in
different-
front of them.
Okay, okay.
Thought we're sharing.
So that's the swaps, but I'll let.
Yeah, so the authority has $400 million of synthetic fixed swaps, which basically means $400 million is a total notional. We have actually two counterparties, Goldman Sachs and Bank of America. They are structured identical. Synthetic fixed rate means that we locked in a very favorable rate when we issued the swap. It's at 3.5% roughly. The reason the swap is showing as an outflow of resources is because in the current environment, the interest that the authority, that the payment that the authority receives from the counterparties is that's a floating rate, and it's less than the
Basically, you're hedging
payment.
the interest rates.
But that's correct, yes.
Okay. On page 26, the unbilled dropped from 140 million to 2.6 million. The second paragraph, the last line.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Michael, were you?
I'm not sure we have the same copy.
So page 20.
Page 26,
Page 26.
So under
the
operating
second
revenue.
paragraph, the very last line, there was a large drop in the unbilled.
Do you want me to
It's a
answer?
different format, but.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Well, Omar Nazem, the treasurer, just whispered to me that that was not unbilled, but it was credits that we had. gotten
Right,
on
right,
the
so
system.
right. That's why I got a little bit confused.
Yes.
Okay, so that was the credit, that was the one, maybe we want to talk about that, the credit for the one-time credit that we
Right, we
issued?
had the, where the mayor had initiated the one-time credit of $183 for single-family homeowners. That was issued for, I believe it was fiscal year 16, and we had gone through the lawsuit that the Real Estate Association of New York, RISNY, had, contested it, and we had gone up to the New York State Court of Appeals, and we prevailed, and so we issued that during fiscal year 18.
All right. So, and Mike, so the sentence before, it meant, there was two thoughts here. So one of the thoughts was to discuss that we have the unbilled and we reported as of June 30th. And the next part was actually the drop, and that drop had to do with the credits.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions? I have a bunch of mock nits.
Okay, great, great. Sure, sure. Well, I just wanted to, we did implement asset retirement obligations. That implementation of that GASB was, it had an effect on the system. We had over, and I think for the city in general, I mean, if you have fuel tanks and chemical tanks, for us, we had about 500. We thought it was material. I think it was about close to a $5 million amount, and we actually implemented that. And that implementation, I think we early implemented because that's effective as of this fiscal year. We implemented it last year.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I'll take all of them at the end.
You got a wheelbarrow?
So we're going to thank the water folks, and DEP
Thank
can
you
get
as
back
well.
to
Yeah,
clean.
thank you for coming.
Yeah.
These are mine and Mark's
Okay.
in here.
Okay, sure. Okay.
So Bob,
Yes.
at the end, I'll give you all of them,
Okay. I'll grab them from you.
unless you want me to practice tossing.
I'm not catching as good as I used to.
So for the rest of these entities, in your request that we streamline the process a little bit, we have a combination of, for the highlights, Jay, who's either the treasurer or the vice president for finance of all these entities, is going to give you a brief summary, and Bob has some accounting issues for you, and then we'll take questions, and I'll pitch in if I can be helpful.
Okay, starting with Transitional Finance Authority, which is financing a good portion of the city capital program. They're issued with future tax-secured bonds backed by income tax and sales tax, or the building aid revenue bonds backed by building aid. For the future tax-secured bonds, we issued $3.6 billion for new money, and we reoffered $161 million of debt. For the building aid revenue bonds, issued $500 million and refunded $1.8 billion. we distributed $4.5 billion of capital bond proceeds to fund capital improvements. TFA received a grant from the city of $2.2 billion, which prepaid debt service in the subsequent year, collected 13.6 of the city income tax, and retained only what we needed for funding of debt service. For future tax secured, we paid $1.2 billion of principal, $1.4 billion of interest, and for the building aid revenue bonds, paid $184 million of principal, $386 million of interest on barbs. And I guess continuing down the line, Bob.
Yeah, and if that's okay with the committee members, would you like us to continue with the rest of the bond financing entities and ask all the questions at the end?
Very similar to all the cities.
Yeah, yeah.
That would be fine. Except I can't believe Star is halfway finished.
Time flies.
I remember when it took the place of Mac.
Yeah,
Right.
Yes, that's right.
Well, that's one I won't dwell on then as we get through. But TSASC was a
Sadly, I remember
corporation.
that, too.
What?
Sadly, I remember that too.
TSASC was created to give the city a little more debt incurring power when it needed it back in the late 90s. It's securitizing the city's interest in the nationwide tobacco settlement with tobacco companies. In 18, it collected $173 million of tobacco settlement revenues, transferred $109 million of that to a trust, which was ultimately for the benefit of the city, and the remaining collections paid $18.6 million of principal and $53.9 million of interest. Star, everyone seems to be very familiar with. The Sales Tax Asset Receivable Corp. Received $170 million from LGAC, the Local Government Assistance Corp., and with that paid $79.7 million of principal and $88.7 million of bond interest, and that brings us to the fiscal year 2005 securitization corp.
Yeah, just maybe two sentences on this. For many of you, you sat through, recounting of this sort of single-purpose transaction. 2002, 2004, it was a high interest rate period. We had refunded some city bonds of high interest rate bonds and had an escrow of high interest rate securities. And we realized that was not a wasting asset, but a wasted opportunity in that we could refinance those bonds and take those high-yielding securities and use those to secure the new bonds that we were issuing and also free up $50 million to the city. So that's what we did. Kind of a sad event in 2020, which is just, I guess, next year. We will actually pay off the last bonds. And so the last opportunity for you to hear about this is a year from now, and then it'll be gone.
I remember that one, too.
And then you got
Yeah, and then moving along to Hudson Yards Infrastructure Corporation, and we received $208 million of revenue. We incurred $40 million of project expense. We paid $104 million of bond interest, and we defeased $30 million in bonds. And Alan's going to give us a little update as you notice that the west side skyline is changing a little bit. I think we would like to give you an update on the project.
Well, just in quick summary, I mean, this is kind of a milestone because we had sort of a unofficial opening of Hudson Yards, particularly the related part, which is over the rail yards, and 2 weeks ago. And the shopping mall, which was really a 9-story relocation of what was at Columbus Circle, moved all over to Hudson Yards. That opened. The sort of the centerpieces, the cultural centerpieces of the project, the Vessel, which is a project that people are climbing all over to get views. There's no purpose for it at all other than it's there. And also the Shed, which is a cultural institution, very mobile. It pulls out into the square, and it's opening on April 3rd with performances by Bjork, and then it's going to go on from there. This was supposed to be a self-financed expansion of the Central Business District. west into sort of no man's land over the rail yards behind the Penn Station, and also north to 42nd Street, where I remember in those days that's where I took my automobile to for tune-ups and so forth. It really had no value to the city and a couple hundred residents, and create really an expansion of the central business district, which sort of guarantees the future of the city. It's a combined use office and residential, and of course the retail as well. Primarily the purpose of it was the office towers, which have already transformed the skyline of the city, where payments in lieu of taxes by the corporations, that would be, by the developers building the towers, and also height bonus payments, we call those district improvement bonuses, and transferring air rights over the rail yards are transferable development rights. So it's, elsewhere in the country, it's known as tax increment financing. In New York, we had a tax increment financing statute that didn't work, so we don't call it tax increment financing. But I was just counting up the buildings. We've got 7 towers, 4 of which are office towers with the large footprints that are appropriate for corporate headquarters, which we've got BlackRock and Wells Fargo and a number of other big corporations that have moved in, and 6 in process. So it's in just 10 years, it's been a great success in terms of attracting the development. We actually went through the Great Recession, and it didn't stop, didn't get slowed down. So that was it. We did have the opening in this month, and Anderson Cooper was the master of ceremonies, and he brought in Big Bird at the end, which all the kids loved, and so it's a great success, and it's already bringing into the city. There's no more payments that are going out from the city. It's bringing in over $100 million a year to the city, and that's going to grow exponentially in the future.
How many buildings totally will there be?
Well, I was trying to count those up yesterday with one of our underwriters. So it's, I would say, and the office tower, the towers, are about 20 in total. In which case we're already over halfway.
And the subway's open, that station's open?
Yes. The idea was if you build the transportation, that the development will come. And so we have one subway station and 2 entrances, and the second entrance just opened. And I guess the last thing I would say is that 30 Hudson Yards, which is the tallest of the buildings, they're all over 900 feet high, actually has an observation tower, which we haven't been allowed to go up in yet, but it's going to open like in a year. Which actually you can look right at the top of the Empire State Building and the World Trade Center, because the observation towers are at the same height. So it's a new icon. I notice in the evening when they're talking on the weather about what the weather is, they don't show the sky behind the Empire State Building. They show the sky behind Hudson Yards and 30 Hudson Yards.
What's the life of this as an entity? I mean, at some point in time, we built everything, and does the
Our bonds.
Our bonds, yes.
2047.
So you'll continue to deal with bonds?
Yes.
For a period of time, but the construction.
Securitization Corp is going to go away, but
The
Hudson Yards.
development is done, but you'll be just financing, managing.
Well, the development isn't done. Again, if we've got 20 buildings or so, we actually had a forecast where, with interspersed with recessions.
But is that development will be sponsored by the Hudson Yard Corporation, that same kind of financing, or it'll be just development on its own?
We're just actually collecting the pilot payments until basically the bonds are paid off,
Right.
but the development is all private.
Are there any other questions? Thank you.
Okay.
I'll grab those finances.
The next up is a presentation by OMB on the Sandy Recovery and Build Back Program.
Better than the trash.
The fund to mayor, we can give that, I think I need to.
How are we doing on time?
Very good.
Yeah, no, he, so, he has to get out of here by an hour.
I think we're gonna be
Okay.
We'll wait for people to get back seated.
Time-wise, we okay?
Yeah, we're plenty of time.
No, no.
This is a turn off
Light has, but some of these entities, they're defunct almost.
Yeah.
We'll just stick to our time. You guys think I need to like show you times? Or no, I'm gonna keep an eye on it. Put your time on. Okay.
So, are we gonna do this? Okay. I had told Jackie I have a problem for May 22nd. So, the meeting could go on, or we could try to.
Oh, that's not, that's
We'll
terrible.
chat briefly when we go back downstairs.
Are we all set?
Yep.
Good morning,
Good
everyone.
morning.
My name's John Grathwall. Hello. I'm a Deputy Director of Budget Resources and Recovery Grant Management at OMB. To my left is Christopher Blanco. He's the Assistant Director of FEMA Disaster Recovery and Homeland Security Grants at OMB. And to my right is Calvin Johnson, who is the Assistant Director for our CDBG-DR Disaster Recovery Grant Program. And I'm going to give a brief introduction to our overall Sandy Grant Program, and then Chris Blanco is going to talk about FEMA, and Calvin Johnson will talk about HUD CDBG-DR. So I just have a quick intro, which I'm going to give an overview.
I didn't know we could do these.
Just to recall what happened in Sandy, as you recall, October 29th, 2012, Hurricane Sandy made landfall. We estimate about $20 billion in damages and economic loss. 10.3% of residents lived in inundated areas. 17% of New York City's landmass was flooded, 44 deaths, 90,000 buildings inundated, 6,500 patient evacuations, and 2 million lost power. And if you look at the little bullets under the map there, and it's a big city, so it's hard to get onto one page, but one half of the housing flooded was outside the FEMA 100-year floodplain, which is kind of an indication that the FEMA 100-year floodplain at the time might not have been super accurate. And one half of the housing in the 100-year floodplain actually had flood insurance, which is a good thing, and it's one thing that the city and the communities need to continue to push, is to encourage people to have the flood insurance because it speeds disaster recovery. Now, a thought to give to this situation looking forward, you know, we're 6.5 years since Sandy, but the city's been looking at
I can't believe it's
What?
6.5 years since then.
Well, I can't believe it's either, but it seems like yesterday. So, but we looked at New York City's Office of Emergency Management using a computer model from the National Hurricane Center, looked at how bad it could have been, given, you know, you've seen the storms in the last couple of years, you've seen the other ones in between that and Sandy, and everybody knows that we're going to have more frequent, more powerful coastal storms. So we have to think as a city about what we need to prepare for looking forward. And with this model, we did a Category 2, Category 3, and a Category 4 storm. And, you know, Sandy, as large as it was, came ashore as a tropical storm, not as a Category 2, 3, or 4 hurricane. And so this model looked at what would happen, you know, in Category 2, 1.1 million New Yorkers in an inundation zone. Category 3, 1.8. Category 4, 2.5. Obviously, it's important for us to take advantage of the federal funding we got in this storm to build as much resiliency as we can with those existing programs. There's a $20 million resiliency program that's been announced in a number of reports. The city's continuing to do more. So we'll touch on a little bit of that today. But these storms, you know, you can just see Category 2, public schools, 270, inundated, 447, Category 3, 597, and so along with these list of facilities. So it's something we have to continue to think about and continue to invest in as we go forward. So our current program, looking at the FEMA public assistance, we have received grants from the federal government of $10.6 billion. And this includes everything that's obligated, a bunch of things that are in the hopper on the way to being obligated, and some in development grants that we believe will be obligated. So it's not everything that's obligated this second, but it's what we believe will be obligated. I have to attend to turning the page electronically. I apologize. So $10.6 billion of FEMA PA, $4.4 billion of HUD funding, a total $15 billion program. And one thing we like to point out to everyone is the timing of when this funding was obligated to the city. People tend to think, you know, that people tend to say, it's 6.5 years later, what have you done? How far are you? And what we like to point out is, we didn't get the money the day after the storm. So this slide here shows the FEMA emergency response type grants where we received within 1 year after the storm, Q4 2013, about 66% of our emergency response funding. And this funding went to overtime or force account labor for people who were responding for the storm, debris removal, a variety of other immediate actions that had to take place quickly after the storm. And we continued over time to seek and receive more funding for these eligible activities. And this is kind of fast, you'll see when we turn to the next page. And it's critical that localities get immediate or relatively quick funding for these immediate expenses. So on the next page, you can see that the permanent repair grants took longer for us to receive from FEMA. And that's because they have a fairly involved process of determining what's eligible, what's specifically damaged by the storm, describing it, writing it up, and getting approval for a grant. So you see that like we got 86% of this permanent work funding 3 years after the storm, Q4 of 2015. And then you ask yourself, oh, how long does it take to do a $100 million city capital project where you have to procure the designer, do the design, procure the construction firms, start construction, implement construction. So this program has a long life, and it's going to take a long time. And if you measured this, we intentionally, with this chart, wanted to measure it against some other municipalities like New Orleans, who'd suffered major disasters. And we're so far out ahead of the pack, we would have had to go on to legal-sized paper, so we dropped the idea. It's also, you can't really compare one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction. You know, New York City is a very large, well-resourced, competent municipality, obviously. Comparing to other jurisdictions wouldn't necessarily be fair, but we're very proud of the speed with which we got this funding, and also a lot of the innovations that helped us get a lot of funding, and particularly a lot of funding for mitigation. So with that intro, I will turn the page to the next one, which is the other large grant stream, which is HUD CDBGDR funding, which was appropriated by Congress and allocated to the city in 3 separate allocations that also occurred over time. And the HUD process, Calvin will get into, it's a block grant, it's different than the FEMA process, which is tied to individual damaged assets. But you can see, again, it's not immediate, and it's over time, and there's a fairly involved process for the city to receive and then become available to use these funds. And then finally, for my little quick intro, this is just the count of billion-dollar disasters, and you can see it's going up. And what we didn't, because it's too complicated for a quick chart, is look at the dollar values associated with these. But obviously, if you're just counting over $1 billion, you get an easy idea that the number of billion-dollar disasters is going up since Sandy. And if you look at 17 and 18, we didn't have the count for 18 yet, but it's larger count, larger dollar values. So that's the world we're living in today. So over to Chris Blanco.
Thanks, John. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the FEMA Public Assistance Program. And so I think while the HUD CDBGDR and the FEMA Public Assistance Program are both disaster grants, they're both vastly different. So I want to try and give a sense for folks about how the two work and the types of problems we encounter on the FEMA side, which we might not see on the HUD side. So I think most people are familiar with FEMA as the federal agency who's responsible for primarily managing emergencies and disasters. And so FEMA public assistance funding is your primary source of funding for city-like services. So this is really what's most aligned with the types of services our city agencies manage, whether that's services or that's long-term construction. It's supplemental federal assistance. There's an expectation that the city maintains some capacity to manage a disaster, and obviously with our Office of Emergency Management and all of our great city agency partners, we have a lot of expertise, but FEMA comes in once that capacity is kind of overwhelmed. FEMA provides 75% cost share, so FEMA will give you 75 cents on the dollar, and you're responsible for financing the last 25%. And if conditions warrant it, they'll up that number to 90%. So the criteria for that is reaching over $1 billion, which we far exceeded. Structurally, FEMA functions a little bit different than the HUD grant, which is, as you know, FEMA is a sub-agency to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. They work with states, and so New York State Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, or DSHS, is the primary grantee, and the City of New York is a sub-grantee underneath that, and we're comprised of a couple different entities. So more than 50 agencies across the city, 30 mayoral agencies, a variety of quasi-city agencies, and then a small handful of public nonprofits where the city is legally responsible for maintaining the facility, or there's a specific legal agreement that requires us to maintain the property. So here is kind of our master chart on the overall program. As you can see, there are a lot of agencies involved. There's a lot of dollars, a lot of different grants. The thing to really focus on is that about 95% of the funding is in our top 10 agencies. And so, as I mentioned before, more than 54 agencies within the city, a lot of them with a fairly small number of PWs, which is their project worksheets are the FEMA grants. If you'll take note of the second column, we have over 700 individual grants. So the FEMA Public Assistance Program is really built from the bottom up. And as John had mentioned and shown in the charts, we have to work with FEMA in order to develop kind of detailed damage descriptions and costs for each individual asset. And I'll go into some more detail about how a PW is written and what's included. And then, as you'll notice, different agencies have different dollars associated with them, and each of their individual portfolios is vastly different, even if we're talking about very similar dollars. Obviously, fire department does very different services than the parks department, but also even agencies that might provide similar services and have similar dollar costs, for instance, like the police department and the fire department, the types of grants they have are vastly different. So police department is heavily focused on the emergency response costs, overtime personnel costs related to response following the storm. Fire department's actually fairly high on the long-term reconstruction, so a lot of their work is tied to repairing firehouses, a lot of work tied to the emergency alarm box network, which you might be familiar with. We'll go into some more details about the kind of diversity that we see in the program. Again, here's kind of a visual representation of the overall program. FEMA is a reimbursement grant program, so agencies are expected to spend money, and then we have to submit reimbursement packages. So this is kind of the four-step process that we have outlined, which is, we have a sense of what the damages are. We work with FEMA to develop a grant in order to get the funding awarded. Agencies start spending against the grants, and then we, OMB, work with agencies in order to submit reimbursement packages to New York State, who ultimately submits it to FEMA. So going into the types of information in the FEMA grant, FEMA grants are known as project worksheets. They contain detailed damage descriptions, so real detailed sheets about water levels, the types of impacts that the storm might have had on a facility. We then develop a scope of work to fix that damage, and then develop a cost estimate in regards to that scope of work. And in some circumstances, we're able to leverage what is known as the FEMA 406 program, which is for mitigation, which allows us to implement resilient reconstruction plans. So building things like flood wall, using more resilient materials, elevating mechanicals, and the city's been really successful in that. And we'll go into that in more detail later. One of the challenges with the FEMA PWs, as was noted before, there's over 700 of them. There's not a lot of consistency in what they might be. So in some circumstances, you might have a single building as a PW. In other circumstances, you might have multiple buildings in a PW. In other circumstances, you might have a single asset related to the different buildings in a PW. So there's no one size fits all model for this, and it creates a lot of challenge for us to track the overall progress of the program and provide guidance to our agencies. As noted before, FEMA pays you 90 cents on the dollar in the circumstances for Sandy. One of the good things is that we're able to amend grants throughout the process. So if the project was originally written at $1 million, but as we know with city capital projects, it comes in at $2 million, we're able to go back to FEMA multiple times to increase the amount of the grant through the standard program. And then finally, as noted before, these grants, FEMA and the HUD grants, are built very differently. FEMA has multiple grants built from the bottom up, where HUD is a block grant with kind of a single grant or maybe two grants, where the management is a little bit different. FEMA classifies work into 7 different categories. We have our emergency work, which is more tied to services, and that's about $2 billion of our portfolio. So it's debris removal, emergency protective measures. These are, again, things which are related to the response during the storm. And the permanent work, which is our long-term reconstruction efforts and resiliency efforts, which total about $8 billion. If anyone can actually read this chart, I apologize, it's so small, but here's a kind of example of what I was talking about the lack of consistency in what FEMA grants look like. So in front of you, you have 5 examples of FEMA grants. Each of them are wildly different from each other. So you might have a small grant for $1,000. That counts as one grant. We also have one grant for close to $1 billion. There's a variety of sites. In some cases, it might be one site. In some cases, it might be multiple sites. In some cases, there might be one contract. In other cases, there might be 50 contracts. So in managing this program, it takes a lot of internal coordination and administration, and we've built a lot of different systems to help us manage this process. Going into the more programmatic side of things, we've really been successful in following kind of the strategy about rebuilding smarter, not just what was there before. And so FEMA provides a variety of different programs that allow us to kind of enhance our assets rather than just put things back in the floodplain. So I think I talked a lot about the standard project, where you have a damaged building, FEMA allows you to rebuild that building and gives you 90 cents on the dollar. We also have other options available to us. So an improved project is where essentially the city is investing its own resources into improving the assets. So you might have had a one-story building. At this point, you decide, hey, maybe we want to do a 2 or 3 story building. FEMA will cap the funding for the repair of the 1-story building, and you can use that money towards the reconstruction or construction of a new facility. Alternate projects is another program that's available through FEMA. This is where we make a determination that the city and its residents would be better served by having a different asset that serves a different function or capacity. So we're allowed to say, instead of constructing a building in the floodplain, we decide we'd like to move that building out of the floodplain. We have this vacant lot. Maybe we turn it into a park. Maybe we turn it into some sort of alternate facility. FEMA allows us the flexibility in doing that, but there's a small penalty that's paid to the federal government. 406 is money that's used to enhance our mitigation and resiliency. So this is money not necessarily tied to the reconstruction, but on top of that. So in many cases, it is funding for flood walls, funding for elevating mechanicals, and other different approaches in making the city more resilient to future storms and flooding. Section 428 is a new program through FEMA that provides a lot more additional flexibility in how we rebuild. And the city was kind of the guinea pig for this program, and it's now kind of the new standard for the long-term reconstruction for some of the storms post-Sandy. And finally, 404 is a competitive grant program that we also manage. It functions a lot differently than the rest of these programs here, but this is for kind of proactive mitigation measures. So everything that we talked about with 406 is really tied to if you have a damaged facility, while you're fixing things, you can add some additional elements that make it more resistant to flooding. 404 is for situations where, you know, you might have gotten lucky with the tide being low at a certain area, or one building didn't get flooded. It didn't get damaged during Sandy, but we know we're vulnerable in the future. So we're able to kind of utilize funding in order to kind of protect things proactively. Here's kind of a quick snapshot of how these programs might function differently. I'm going to just quickly go through this since I'm running short on time. And finally, you know, I think we've had a lot of success in managing the Sandy recovery program, and that's really tied to the strong internal controls and administration that we have at OMB. Kind of as a oversight agency, we kind of have a kinship with FEMA in looking to make sure that people follow the rules and don't waste money. So, you know, we've developed a variety of systems to supplement the existing city systems to allow us to actually track and manage a lot of the information that we're getting from agencies. This allows us to make kind of strategic decisions and work with FEMA on maximizing funding. Obviously, with the last 2 slides, there's a lot of different programs. City agencies aren't experts in how all the programs work, but us at OMB have spent a lot of time developing our expertise, and so it allows us to kind of make central decisions and work with agencies to try to find the best solution for whatever problems they might be facing. I think we've achieved a lot of success in the FEMA program, mostly through the dollars that we've been able to secure. So I think when I took over the program in 2013, 2014, we were looking at a portfolio of about $5 billion. We're close to about $11 billion at this point, and I think we're only going to continue to keep going up, and hopefully we'll be able to hold on to as much of this funding as possible. And we've really achieved this through kind of pushing the boundaries with the policy with FEMA, working with them in order to find better solutions to some of the problems that they've faced in other hurricanes such as Katrina. They've been a great partner to us, and we've really been able to find a lot of creative solutions on how to approach the various kind of mitigation and disaster recovery problems that we face. And we've basically looked at where FEMA has failed, looked at finding ways that are more efficient and quick, and able to not just secure additional funding, but to manage things more efficiently. These are just some of the programmatic things that we've been able to achieve over the years. And finally, this is just kind of a quick timeline about where the program is going, where we're at right now. If you note, the arrows go to a dotted line. So if we were to actually do a realistic timeline, we need 2 or 3 more slides to actually cover the length of the entire program when you include closeout. So, you know, this is a long-term process. I know it seems like an eternity since Sandy's happened, but we still have a lot of work that needs to be accomplished. And we continue to appreciate the support that we get from all the city agencies and our partners throughout the city. So with that, I'll pass it over to Calvin.
Do you guys have any questions on this so far?
A broad question, how has the relationship been with the state in this process?
Go ahead.
I think it's been fairly good. We've had a strong relationship with New York State Department of Homeland Security Emergency Services, going back to 9/11, as well as, our annual Homeland Security funding allocations. So they've been good partners. They've been really supportive of us and have helped us through a variety of different issues.
Okay, because New York is very much different than a lot of other localities. The city of New York has probably got more resources to do this stuff than the traditional. And question is, what does the state add to the process as far as?
Well, first of all, they're the grantee.
I know, yes.
And that adds a lot. And because of that, we have consistently partnered with them, and, early on they supported us because they knew more about this than we did. Now it's kind of mutual support, and we're continuing. And our relationship and our attitude towards FEMA is the same. Mm-hmm. We support them to come to the right conclusion, and they've come to trust us because we've never presented them with anything that didn't turn out to be good for them in the end. And it's similar to our, relationship with New York State. So it's been a strong partnership.
And I would add that, while New York City does have a good background in managing disasters, we don't really see disasters to the same frequency as New York State, so they can provide a lot of context as far as kind of the interactions with FEMA on some of the other kind of disasters throughout the state that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So they help us prepare for audits, they help us understand kind of what are the bigger picture issues and kind of what are the strategic pushes from kind of FEMA headquarters on them. So we can get ahead of issues or prepare for the future.
And on the federal level, the PWs, how involved is the federal FEMA folks in preparation of those PWs?
Very involved, as are people from the state and our people from the city. But for example, we had to take federal folks and state folks to our damaged facilities. They don't know where they are. And, we did a lot of work compiling the damages, writing up the scope of repair, but we had input from them along the way, the entire way.
Yeah, and ultimately, FEMA and New York State are responsible for writing the PWs themselves. We provide them with all the backup material, provide feedback on the final product that they give us, but they're the ones who are actually responsible for developing and writing and submitting the grant.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you, John. Thank you, members of the Audit Committee. My name is Calvin Johnson. I'm going to cover the HUD source of funding the city has been using for Sandy recovery. The grant funding that we get from HUD is called the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery. And it builds really off of the history of the city of New York being an entitlement community, receiving community development funding from HUD on an ongoing basis, annual basis, for 40 plus years. And it also allowed the city of New York to be a direct grantee from HUD. So unlike the FEMA funding, we're not a sub-grantee for this particular source of funding. The state of New York also received its own CDBG-DR allocation. We're a smaller sub-grantee for that source of funding, but I'm not going to talk about the CDBG-DR funding we're getting from the state. One of the things I do want to sort of emphasize to answer the question, why is HUD involved in disaster recovery? It sort of builds off of its community development program. HUD is one of the few federal agencies that really has ongoing direct relationships to municipalities, tribal governments, and other impacted communities. And there's a notion that you need to have a recovery process that is steered by and responsive to the needs of the community. The funding also comes in the form of a block grant, which allows the city, through a community engagement process, to associate those funds to cover a variety of unmet needs in various areas of recovery. So not just public services and government services and fixing damaged assets, but also looking at assistance for homeowners, tenants, small businesses, and it also allows for us to think about moving forward and fund resiliency to protect our investments. The CDBGDR funding is also structured as gap filler. So it comes in once all other sources of funding have been taken into account. So whether that's through FEMA with the Public Assistance Program, which Chris just explained to you, or through the FEMA Individual Assistance Program, or loans and grants from Small Business Administration to homeowners and small businesses, or even private insurance. And it gives us the flexibility to associate these funds with our recovery needs. The funding that the city received was appropriated from Congress in Public Law 113-2, which was signed by President Obama in January 2013. It was a nationwide appropriation, and it took a little while for individual allocations for the different grantees to be identified. And as John had shown on an earlier slide, it took a little bit of time for the city to have full access to the funding that we received. And then some of the requirements of the CDBGDR funding build off of the non-disaster recovery community development program. We need to address a specific disaster, but we also need to identify an eligible activity in accordance with the non-disaster regulations. And we also need to think about what's called the national objective, which basically there are three categories of that. One is to address urgent needs. Second is to benefit low to moderate income populations. And the third is to address slum and blight. Over 50% of the CDBGDR funding needs to go towards benefiting low to moderate income communities or individuals. Just in terms of an overview of the CDBGDR funding, we received $4.2 billion in the block grant at the end of the day across three allocations. We also received one project-specific grant through the National Disaster Resilience Competition, which is part of the same congressional appropriation for these funds. That was a $176 million grant. So all told, we're getting $4.4 billion from HUD for our recovery. And where we are in our recovery, we're actually fairly proud of our progress. So 6.5 years out from the date of the storm, we've been reimbursed by the federal government for over 75% of the total block grant. And similar to the FEMA funding, this is also structured as a reimbursement grant. So the city spends funding first, and then we go to HUD to seek reimbursement. A lot of our programming isn't necessarily aligned on a city agency by city agency basis, although that's certainly a component of it too, but really targeting different types of recovery programs. So for example, starting with housing, the vast majority of the grant, which is no surprise coming from HUD, which is a federal housing and urban development agency, is oriented towards assisting homeowners and tenants of both multifamily buildings, and also in public housing. Amy Peterson and Liz Greenstein will give you an overview of the Build It Back program, which is our single-family housing recovery program. But as you can see, housing recovery is a significant piece of where the grant funding is going. Also assisting small businesses. We've created a program which we call Infrastructure and Other City Services. One of the innovations with the HUD funding is that it can actually be used as a source of funding to cover the cost share on the FEMA program. So our Infrastructure and Other City Services program is, in essence, our use of HUD funding to cover a portion of the overall FEMA cost share, and that overlies with the programs that Chris gave you an overview of, too. And then, as I mentioned before, is sort of this investment is innovative in the way that it's not just repairing damaged facilities, but is also thinking about resiliency. It's thinking about protecting the coastline of New York City. And I'll go through some of the highlights of programs in that resiliency context. I think one of the areas in which we're fairly proud of is from our reimbursement schedule. New York City really has been amongst the three Sandy grantees, New York State, New Jersey, and New York City, the largest, we've been receiving the largest share of CDBGDR funds as reimbursements on a quarterly basis fairly consistently over the last couple of years. And I think our program was a little slower to ramp up, but once we're in full production mode, we've been drawing down funding. And so this chart gives you a little representation of, on a quarterly basis, what share of the total federal dollars that are moving out of the federal treasury and into the hands of grantees New York City represents. One of the questions that we think is interesting for you all in the audit committee is thinking about some of the statistics and behind-the-scenes metrics of what it takes to actually process and manage $4.4 billion of funding. And so earlier gave you a sense of the spending accomplishments and reimbursement accomplishments that we've hit. In order to spend money on eligible work, we've created 50 different governing documents that consist of memoranda of understanding with other city agencies, as well as subrecipient agreements with outside entities, whether that's NYCHA or their Health and Hospitals Corporation, which are part of the city's sort of family of agencies, or even outside institutions with subrecipient agreements in place. We've got over 1,200 individual contract records, many of which are under $25,000 in magnitudes, as it's just the general purchases of running and administering a program, many of which are significantly larger. We also have a requirement to publish CDBGDR-funded contracts on our website, so a lot of the information is publicly available. And to date, we've processed over 62,000 individual electronic fund transfer records. So it's just indication of how much money is flowing in an individual basis. In order to receive funding from HUD, over 15,000 individual invoices have been packaged together, as close to 4,000 individual invoice transactions. So sort of you get a sense of there's a bit of an army behind the scenes that's processing and administering these funds. And we're doing that in a compliant manner. We're really focused on managing these funds responsibly. In terms of beneficiaries, over 10,000 individual households are receiving assistance through the single-family program. Almost 20,000 households receiving assistance through the multifamily program. Over 700 small businesses, and as I mentioned, we have a requirement that over 50% of the funding goes to low to moderate income communities and individuals. For the funding we've been reimbursed for to date, 53% of the dollars have gone towards those populations. And again, close to 13,000 individual environmental review records, a lot of which are on a site-by-site basis through the Build It Back program. And in terms of compliance and oversight, I think something the audit committee would be interested in is just the amount of oversight we receive. We're subject to OMB's internal audit program, which is a new team created within OMB, but as a requirement of HUD and Congress for the city to receive these funds. We've been monitored by HUD 12 times to date. That's the HUD program staff that we interact with on a regular basis. They'll be visiting us next week again. And we've been audited by the Inspector General at HUD 8 different times. And we have a fairly good compliance record that we really are proud of. One of the tools that we created to manage these funds, and it's not just the CDBGDR funds, but it's the FEMA funding as well, is we've created a grant management system. What this is, it's a fairly elaborate database that assembles all the documents associated with the reimbursement packages. It allows us to manage the budget, work with the city's financial management system, but also with HUD's reporting system. Allows us to store contracts and other underlying documentation, and to sort of track the progress and the work that we do. We have some additional overlays in the grant management system that are unique to the management of the FEMA funding as well too. But it's a tool that we developed from scratch, but that we're relatively proud of. The next thing I'm going to do is go through not some systematic and process innovations, but highlight a couple of innovative projects. As John mentioned, the city has a $20 billion resiliency plan. A significant piece of that are federally funded projects, and I'm going to just go through briefly 3 of those projects that are funded by the HUD block grant. You might have heard of the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project. It's a project which the city received funding for through the Rebuild by Design competition. It was an international design competition, and the east side of Manhattan, from 25th Street on the north down to Montgomery Street at the south end, was the area that was identified as appropriate low to moderate income community in need of protection. The city received about $1/3 billion for this project. We've since supplemented that with additional city capital investments, recognizing that federal funding is something we can build off of, but can't be solely dependent upon to deliver resilience the city needs. It's a 2.4 mile long project, and it really has taken the shape that it exists in as a result of community feedback, community engagement, public dialogue, and working also, with engineers in terms of what's feasible. And we're targeted for groundbreaking on that project next spring. That's sort of the first phase in a longer series of coastal protection projects, originally under the brand of the Big U, not a term we're using so much anymore, but the notion is you build a U around Manhattan to protect Lower Manhattan. The next segment of that, which also is for independent utility, is in the Two Bridges neighborhood of Manhattan. This is this was a competition grant. This was the separate non-block grant funding we're receiving from HUD, $176 million there. Again, we're also leveraging our own city capital funds on top of that. And it's really going to look at, protection of a community in Lower Manhattan, thinking also about stormwater management and rainfall, and not just an impact of flooding during a storm event, also designed to take sea level rise into account. And that project is currently in design. And then the last project I'll highlight is also through the Rebuild by Design program. It's also a resiliency project, but thinking about coastal vulnerabilities and resiliency in a slightly different way, sort of using energy resiliency to ensure that we have continuous and smooth operations of the city's food distribution center on the Hunts Point Peninsula in the South Bronx. So the city's produce market, meat market, fish market are all located in this economic or environmental justice community. Part of the idea is if there's flooding, you don't want to lose power. As John mentioned, there was significant loss of power during Sandy. So we're creating backup power systems to ensure continuous operations. And this is also a project that has evolved based on community feedback. So it now significantly incorporates solar into it. Backup generators that were going to be natural gas powered are no longer a key piece of the project. And it's really to say the projects that we're using the HUD funding to advance do evolve, and a lot of that evolution is motivated by feedback from the community. So with that, I'll conclude the conversation, and I guess we can take additional questions before we hand things over to the Build It Back team. Thank you.
On a broad question, if I understand correctly, the CBD HUD has funding that would assist, if you will, non-governmental agencies, private development.
That's correct.
Unlike what we're running through the FEMA numbers, are primarily aid going to governmental agencies. And FEMA separately, besides you, could do individual assistance, but that doesn't run through the city's program, correct?
Yep.
And then on the FEMA side, do you have anywhere near the federal auditors coming in looking over your shoulder as they do on the CBDG?
As far as the actual number of audits that we've gone through, I think we have a similar number. As far as the actual monitorings, FEMA doesn't have that same level of presence, but we do we're also subject to the OMB internal
Right.
audit, as well as our own
Just
monitoring.
historically, they seem to have always gotten the heavy end of the audit side of these projects. I just wonder if that...
It's roughly equal
It's
on
roughly equal.
the OIG cognizant federal agency auditing.
And some of that comes from a history of fraud, waste, and abuse in other jurisdictions for other recovery efforts. I think with the level of sophistication we have here in New York City and our financial controls.
We do a lot to prevent those problems. from coming about in the
Absolutely.
first
That
place.
said, we still get the same scrutiny.
But
Yeah.
usually have a better success rate on the
We have a
audits.
very good audit success rate, that's right.
And on the grant management?
I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead.
I would also add that the program structure kind of lends itself to the different interactions where FEMA has a lot more structure as far as you have this project and you have to follow this scope of work, whereas the block grant's a lot more open and I guess there's a lot more opportunity to mess it up.
Well, yeah, it's general guidance versus specific
Yeah,
guidance.
Yeah, that's right.
On the grants management system that you developed, is that used beyond the FEMA CDBG area, or is it just a grants management system for these two areas?
Yes, and it is not used beyond, and yes, it's just for the two areas. So no and yes to your question.
Question for you then, John, is there a reason why it doesn't expand out?
Well, we're completely busy up to our eyeballs with managing these two grant streams. There have been some overtime conversations at OMB broadly about management of federal grants, but I can't speak to those right now.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think the work that we put in designing systems from scratch, a lot of the system is tailored to the individual needs of each grant. And there's some, differences between how we manage the FEMA grant and the DR grant through that grant management system. I think we're certainly open to the notion of taking best practices and good ideas out of the system and applying it to other grants.
It's just a larger question for the city and grant management beyond your specific portfolio. as to
Good
whether-
question.
Yeah.
If in fact you've created a good product, maybe there's a way we can.
Yeah, I think one thing
Utilize
we've
it.
learned is, every grantor has different requirements and just the, different.
Well, that's
yeah.
why we haven't had one, is that the
Could
history
you-
from the city's perspective is that they've been so specific that the generic grants management system never works. But
Yeah.
if you have a good product, it might not
Does
hurt
this
to look at it.
interact with FMS?
It does. So it's driven by a data feed on a daily basis, and it sort of is the bridge between our FMS system and on the HUD side, the DRGR system, disaster recovery grant reporting, and then Chris can speak on the interaction on the FEMA side.
Yeah, I would say, going back to Bud's question, I think because we have so many agencies who are utilizing the grants management system in the FEMA portfolio, there's a number of items where it's like, oh, this is a good idea, like maybe we should incorporate that into our own tracking, but we haven't really built out anything specific to any other grants besides FEMA. And even when we built the HUD program into it, it was where we did have overlap for the match component, it was fairly straightforward, but it was essentially a completely new set of tables and a new system entirely for the HUD section.
But basically, we are completely overwhelmed with properly managing this program, and we're looking to successfully do that. And if anyone can get lessons from our work, we're available to talk about it, but we're not looking for new areas to do, personally. I think it's a good idea for a broader conversation,
well,
but.
that's what I'm
but
saying. If
we're
this is working
tapped out.
well, maybe there's other parts of the government that should look at it as a model to be used elsewhere. Again, broad, without getting into specific names, on the timing of this, on the couple charts that you put up, I would say in my terminology, the timing, the first set of grants were those things where it's emergency response. You actually did the work because you had to do it. It was emergency. You weren't going and asking for permission for it.
Largely, yes, but not completely. Like, for example, there are all sorts of temporary facilities that are still temporary facilities because the permanent repair has not yet done, whether it's a boiler at a school or a boiler at a nitro development. So there are some, you're correct, it is largely done, and it's largely done perhaps before you get the grants. FEMA works hard to get those emergency response grants obligated fast, but still, the work has to happen immediately.
Right. That's kind of the key in that area, is that you're not going to FEMA and talking about what we need to do. We got an emergency, we're going out and doing it.
And from an OMB perspective, central financial management, write the directives and the communications to the agencies to make sure they're tracking their costs initially.
Appropriately, so that when you do the next step, you'll have that information.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas the second, longer-term projects, you're developing a mitigation project or a new project or whatever, and and you're pretty much making sure that you got everything, all your ducks in a row at the start of that project, because it's not something I have to do today because of the emergency.
And it's very a lengthy process to go out and describe a detailed damage
Oh, yeah.
description of every damaged asset all across the city.
There's a whole litany of things you have to do, but
Yes.
the broad categorization is, lack of a better term, we're going to do this emergency stuff whether FEMA was coming to reimburse us in the first place, because it's stuff that we really got to do, and we're, as a city, making that decision to do it. The second block of material, we may be doing some of it anyhow, even if FEMA wasn't assisting us, but it's a longer-term plan, and it's not something that we're just saying, go ahead and do. It's part of a decision-making process.
I would think that, you know, every damaged school is going to be repaired. We know there's a federal program to get assistance and fund a large portion of it, like every other jurisdiction in this country. We're aware how much we pay in to the federal government, more than comes back to us. So we went out and, you know, assumed we were going to repair everything. We assumed we were going to get the maximum eligible federal reimbursement, and then the gaps we fill with local tax.
And then there was mitigation on top
Right,
of that,
and
which is
mitigation.
important.
Right, exactly. Okay, with that, maybe
Thank
we'll
you.
turn over to Amy Peterson and Liz Greenstein and Build It Back.
Hi, thank you.
Just one caution, we have to leave, the three of us have to leave perhaps before Amy's done.
Oh, no. Okay.
But it will be at the last, you know, maybe you'll get done. We have to leave at 11:45.
Okay.
If
Well,
not
I've even
sooner.
put like the little, I have 20 minutes, right?
Okay, you can go a little longer. We've got some extra time.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Peterson. I'm the director of the Mayor's Office of Housing Recovery Operations, which has been managing the Build It Back program. I started almost exactly 5 years ago, so a year and a half after the storm. This is a neighborhood in New Dorp Beach, and so our work was to help single-family homeowners recover and rebuild and restore the neighborhoods and the communities. Sandy impacted the communities across Staten Island, Queens, Brooklyn. Some of the hardest hit communities were Broad Channel, Breezy Point, Canarsie, New Dorp Beach, Midland Beach. All of these neighborhoods were impacted. A couple things that were really helpful to me, and as part of the HUD process, you have to lay out what was the damage and what was the needs assessment. And so in 2012 and 2013, there were 2 damage assessments that were done that characterized severe or major damage, which was basically flooding that could have destroyed the homes, but certainly got into the first floor of their living spaces, and then moderate damage, which is more about flooding in the basements, little impact on the living spaces. So there were about 2,100 homes that had severe or major damage, with over 200 completely destroyed, and there were about 15,000 homes with moderate damage. And this happened in neighborhoods. These neighborhoods are much more homeowner occupied. There's a lot more single-family homes than in other communities, and there's a higher rate of seniors and disabled populations. Build It Back was launched in 2013 in the summer, in June. The Stafford Act lays out the order of disaster benefits that go to people: FEMA individual assistance, National Flood Insurance Program. The city creatively used the FEMA public assistance for our rapid repairs program. Sorry, that should have been SBA loans, and private insurance. The HUD Community Development Block Grant disaster recovery is the funding of last resort. And that's important to keep in mind, both in the difficulty of establishing the program and all the things we need to go through to have federal compliance. Also, this disaster didn't work that well, and you probably saw stories about underpayments of NFIP insurance across the board. SBA loans rolled out completely confusingly across the program, and really also a big piece of what happened, you know, Sandy obviously was unprecedented, never happened before, anything to this magnitude, and certainly some of the neighborhoods that were hit had never seen flooding before and weren't even mapped in the flood zone. So New Howard Beach, Canarsie, some of the neighborhoods in Staten Island, had never seen flooding before and weren't in the flood zone. So when you think about who we were trying to help, it were people whose homes were completely destroyed in neighborhoods that had seen flooding before, should have had flood insurance in neighborhoods like Broad Channel, but then half of the housing that was flooded was outside of FEMA's 100-year floodplain, and half of the housing in the floodplain didn't even have flood insurance. So there was a real kind of impact beyond anything anyone had ever seen before. And this map on the right is one of my favorite maps in trying to figure out why Build It Back was so expensive and how complicated the work we're doing is. So the map on the left shows all the neighborhoods that were impacted, and then the map on the right, and sorry, it's probably hard to see, but hopefully you'll get a copy, is from the SIR report, and it talks about the soil conditions in the neighborhoods that were impacted. And I think, and actually I don't have it in front of me, but the word is post-glacial deposits. So the soil conditions in the neighborhoods that we're rebuilding in are very poor, to put it mildly. So the Build It Back program was designed again in 2013, and about that same time, in discussing kind of other disasters and other problems with disaster recovery. There was a decision that came out from HUD about Katrina funding and the fact that a lot of the funding that was given directly to homeowners to rebuild their homes and to do repairs and elevate their homes had not been used for that purpose at all. And so the decision that the city made was to minimize the risk to homeowners, to do the work where we controlled how the work happened, so as opposed to just sending out checks to people, to actually manage this work. The complexities of building in New York City, which I now know quite well, also led to the city doing this to minimize the risk to the homeowners, to the city, and to HUD by doing this, and to ensure that the homes that we built were fully compliant. There are a lot of federal regulations above and beyond flood compliance that are required, and certainly a lot of local requirements that are put in place. And in spending federal funding, we really needed to make sure we met the cost reasonableness piece of this, which is a big part of what we managed to. So I think you've probably all heard, Build It Back, very expensive. It's important to talk about what drives the cost and why it is so expensive. And so this is a home in Gerritsen Beach. And so in most of these communities, in a lot of these communities, when the sewage treatment plants, water waste treatment plants were built, and I don't know exactly when, but middle of the 1900s, streets were elevated. I think homeowners at that point got a small amount of money to elevate their homes, but many didn't. And so you can see the house on the left is a Gerritsen Beach house. It was below street grade, certainly below the requirement. Elevated DFE is the design flood elevation that we're supposed to build to. So of course this home had damage. It was below street grade, certainly below the flood elevation. Gerritsen Beach had a significant amount of flooding, so we needed to elevate this home, and the picture on the right is a picture of the elevated home. Additionally, and you can't read this, but every single thing changed along the way, clearly through 2016 and even after that, related to the zoning requirements, what was required for the building code. The flood maps changed multiple times during this piece. The flood insurance itself changed, and the zoning changed in ways that we went through processes to have the zoning changed for us. So all of these things were ways that the city responded, rightfully so, to the to Sandy and to the climate change and to all the things that were happening, but they also impacted all the work we were doing in trying to design and rebuild these homes. People talk about elevating a home and people talk about the cost with actually lifting the home, but elevating a home is much more complicated than just lifting it. Disconnecting and reconnecting utilities is a very timely and difficult process, and one that often relates to additional costs due to upgrading the services for electric and gas. Because of the soil conditions in these homes and because these homes were so close to each other, there was an original assessment that we could lift the homes and set them right back down on their existing foundations after raising it a little bit. That wasn't what happened. We needed to lift the homes. The homes are then jacked up, and you can see that We then went through multiple foundation reviews to determine that helical piles were the best way to support the homes. And so we drove helical piles below over 90% of the homes that we elevated to ensure that they would meet the big requirement in the building code now is due to storm surge. So the storm surge and the wave action that happens after a storm. Install new foundations, then you set the home back down. And then there's all the requirements, you now have an elevated home. So both stairs, in most instances, despite the fact that the building code doesn't actually require it, we ended up putting 2 sets of stairs. It's really something that people want, to be able to get in and out of their house in 2 ways. As I mentioned, a lot of these people are seniors, so we put in accessibility lifts. In 2013, there was a study that was done with our office in partnership with FEMA that talked about that idea of kind of lifting the home and setting back down. And when we realized that the costs were going to be significantly more than we expected, we looked back at that study to figure out what the differences were. And so there were the things I just talked about, that there were also things like sprinkler code. All of the areas that we're building in our fire district. And so in almost all of the homes we elevated, we needed to install sprinklers in the homes, which requires higher water pressure and potentially new water mains. It's really important to us, obviously, to control the costs and make sure we were spending the money in the right way. So as I mentioned, we did foundation design reviews. We established minimum program standards across all of the work so that we were ensuring that we were doing equitable work across it, limited scope, and then really focused on ensuring we had competitive bidding. When the program first started in 2013, there were 2 sets of contractors that were managed partially by my office, the Housing Recovery Office. There were JOCS contracts, and there were also contracts that were managed by HPD to do the rebuilds. It was clear by 2014 that there was not enough construction capacity. So we brought in the Department of Design and Construction. They hired CMs that could both increase actually design capacity and construction capacity, put in place a pre-qualified list of contractors so we could do repeated bidding of the work, which allowed us to continue to do the work, but continue to get competitive costs and continue to expand the contractor pool. So we had a huge variety of contractors doing this work. Other strategies we use both for accelerated construction and to control costs. Under the CMs, we did both a contractor-controlled insurance program, but we also put in a pre-fund account to pay money to the construction managers so they could pay the contractors faster and ensure that the work continued. That was incredibly important for us and had significant controls in place to ensure that both the idea of doing the work faster was happening, but that we were not at risk for any of the funds that we were using. We also worked closely with Mayor's Office of Operations, Department of Buildings, and all the agencies that deal with building homes to put in place an Accelerate Build It Back guide. Permits and requirements, a lot of things that need to happen. We also, in 2017, I want to say, started a modular home program. When you elevate a home, these homes are about 80 years old, and all of the life safety upgrades you have to do in using federal funding, we realized that in many instances, it makes more sense just to demo the home and build a new home because you almost end up rebuilding the home in place. There's a lot of structural issues, all of those things. So we put in place a modular program. People were very skeptical about us being able to deliver and set modular homes in these really tight communities, but we worked closely with the Department of Transportation and the Police Department and Buildings Department. We had multiple companies that built the modular homes, and we put the work in 3 packages. One was to demo and build the new foundation. The other was to build the home, transport it, and set it. And that would happen in one day. And that was really transformative for the communities, not to see this house in the air for months and months and months. Instead, they saw a vacant lot, a foundation, and then a day later a house, which is definitely a different perspective on what's happening. And as of this March, we've got 82 of the 100 homes substantially complete. They talked a little bit about HUD and the compliance and review. We're have a huge partnership with HUD, and it's been incredibly important to us all along the way to work in partnership with them in what we're doing. One thing that was new in the HUD funding for Sandy was that there was a timeline for it. So there was a lot of pressure when I first started. Why aren't you spending the money? Why aren't you doing this work? You need to get this work done. And so working with them to do that. There was a new program element, the reimbursement program, and we put in place a good reimbursement program. It's already been audited, and that was a way to help people get funds much more quickly than had happened before. It's a really good program. We based it on damage assessments and cost estimates as opposed to actually doing receipts, which we thought was a real risk for fraud. We have worked with HUD along the way on our cost reasonable review process. We had an action plan where we had to increase the funding to the Build It Back program by $500 million. And they were involved up into that process in understanding how we're doing our costs and our cost reasonable review, and in understanding the things that I talked about earlier that added cost to the program. And they were helpful in strategies for controlling costs. We added incentives to our acquisition program, which I'll talk about in a bit, that they worked with us on. Additionally, because they're housing and urban development, they really pushed on community housing and linking what we were doing to the longer term projects. And they were very interested, and we did a number of site visits with them, which really brought, I think, the work that we were doing with them home to them and personalized it, and then they could see how New York City is unique, right? If you walk through the neighborhoods of Staten Island, if you walk through Garrettson Beach, if you see the attached homes in Coney Island, you get a much better sense of how complex it is to build in New York City. Acquisition and buyout, the state had a buyout program initially. We had an acquisition program. Having an acquisition and buyout program immediately following a storm is something that is incredibly important. We've worked over the last 5 years to both establish some homes that we said were unbuildable. You know, the soil conditions aren't good. There might not be utilities to your home. It's just not the right solution. And so we said some homes were unbuildable. We put our own buyout program in place to allow people to do that, and we also acquired homes. We did it strategically in some neighborhoods where we didn't want people to rebuild, and we did it in some neighborhoods strategically where we wanted to ensure that we could rebuild. Sheepshead Bay Courts, and I don't know if anyone's been to Sheepshead Bay Courts. These are rows of homes that are between the rows of homes that sit on the street and have a sidewalk between them, so they're not really courts, but that's what they're called. We were able to upgrade the infrastructure, so the before photo shows what these homes look like, especially in Stanton Court. The infrastructure was incredibly substandard. There was a huge amount of leakage of all of their infrastructure and just collapse of their infrastructure at the storm. And so this was the one neighborhood where we actually got every neighbor on the block to participate either by purchasing their homes or elevating and rebuilding their homes. And we're finishing that work now. We also combined it with investment from HUD for infrastructure work, and we're upgrading all of the utilities to that neighborhood. And it's a really good model where you can do everyone's home. This program has always been homeowner choice, so getting every homeowner to participate isn't something that typically happens. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we were able to take a very small portion of our money, about $3 million. It was really important to us that Sandy residents actually got to rebuild the homes, actually got opportunities to train for construction work, and we're linked to all the jobs. So we invested $3 million to open a center in Coney Island where people could go in. We put a workforce development worker in Far Rockaway and in Staten Island also, and we had all of our contractors place their jobs with, we linked onto the city's Workforce One system, so we called it Sandy Recovery Workforce One. So we connected people, we got about 150 people into the construction unions by funding actual training, but we also connected unemployed landscape architects who lived on Staten Island with the work we were doing. And it was incredibly important and really gave people the opportunity to participate in the work they were doing. The man on the top, Jamel Dickerson, went to a PTA meeting, met one of our staff, heard about Sandy Recovery Workforce One, got a job rebuilding homes in Far Rock, got a got placed with the Carpenters Union after training, worked to rebuild homes in Far Rockaway, would go to the supermarket and somebody would be like, were you just building that home? And he would tell the story of how he's able to rebuild these homes. And his quote at the top is, it really was a good opportunity for people who lived in these communities to rebuild the communities. So the good news is we are finishing Build It Back. We are at about 98. We have about the last 100 or so homes that we're finishing. So we've really completed the vast bulk of the program. There's about 12,500 families who are being served through this because it is a 1 to 4 unit families. And we're really excited to just have these neighborhoods be so much more protected. And if you drive through them, you can see that. I think as OMB already mentioned, our grant was $2.2 billion. We've spent over 90% of it, and I've almost been reimbursed the 90%. We too have a team that focuses on invoice and paying contractors and reimbursement and really ensuring that we're in compliance with the HUD funds and have already started the closeout process, which is exciting to talk about. So we talked a lot about people who were served, so that meant they got a check, their construction started, or we purchased their home. So we've got 5 homes that we still may purchase, but we're at 99.96% of served, and 97% of the applicants are complete. Some of the construction was managed by the city, and so there's only about 20 homes remaining. The bulk of the work that's remaining in the construction is in those courts that I talked about that's linked to the infrastructure and other things. So we're really wrapping up this work and getting these homeowners home. And so one of the things, especially when we were going back for the additional funding, and when people talk about who we served, and people, you may have heard people talk about this 20,000 number of people who applied for Build It Back and where they served. If you go back to the damage assessments and the 2,100 or so homes that had severe and major damage and the 15,000 homes that had moderate damage, that's about the number we're serving. We're serving about 2,200 homeowners through either elevation, rebuild, or acquisition in partnership with the state's buyout program. And on the moderate damage, we're serving about 6,500 applicants, but we went back and looked at everyone who applied, and there were another 9,000 applicants to Build It Back, or people who just registered with Build It Back, who got service either through NFIP, through SBA, through FEMA IA. So they got some sort of funding from the federal government or from private insurance, and so we're able to rebuild. And as we mentioned, our funding is the funding of last resort. So it's really important for us to make sure that in the end we were serving the people who received the damage in alignment. We hired an outside consultant, the CUNY Labor Studies,
Center for Urban Research.
Center for Urban Research, to do an attrition study, because again, everyone talks about 20,000 people applied. It's not exactly true. We really reached out, the city did, I wasn't here in 2013, but really reached out to get the widest, anybody who had any damage, reach out, Build It Back. Program wasn't even, we didn't even know what it meant that. We certainly didn't have all the funding at that point. So 20,000 people registered with the program. A quarter of those, 4,700, that's all they did. They registered, they made a phone call, that's all they did. They didn't even take a step to fill out an application. Another quarter of the group actually did fill out an application. At the end of the application process, you get a program option. And that 2,600, that 26% group never chose an option, so they never even went forward with a benefit. So in reality, it was a much smaller group that accepted an option and moved forward, and a very smaller group that only 4% who left after deciding what benefit they would want. A couple of the things that we put in place that really helped with the keeping people in the program was we invested in legal and financial counseling for the homeowners through Center for New York City Neighborhoods in partnership with a lot of other groups. And that helped people figure out how to deal with the benefits they'd receive from other sources. It helped people deal with issues with their home, and it has to be your home. You have to have the right documentation to be able to get into the program and stay in the program. So that really helped people. Demographics didn't play a role in attrition, but we really served the intended purpose. The applicants who had remaining disaster benefits, didn't stay with the program because they still had funds and they would have had to kind of give us those funds to do more work, and so they didn't stay with the program. And the applicants who had the highest damage stayed with the program. So, and again, I said this at the beginning, but I'll say it again, our program really served two distinct groups of people, right? People whose homes were damaged, destroyed, who we elevated and rebuilt, and they didn't have the funding to do that work, and we did that work for them. We were really committed to ensuring that these communities remain affordable. So in other areas where the investment isn't made by the city in rebuilding the homes, people sell their homes and they get rebuilt by people who have a lot more money. And so we really wanted to keep these long-standing communities in place. And so that was what we did by investing in that money. And then the other group was people who had some damage, didn't have benefits maybe because they weren't even in a flood zone before. So we helped them fill that gap with both reimbursement and some repair work that we did. The attrition report informed a lot of lessons learned and how we should do this moving forward. And it was really helpful in thinking about how to design a program. You know, we're very determined not to lose the wealth of knowledge we now have after this and to ensure that we can move forward. Some of the big lessons are that cast a wide net, make sure you reach out to everyone, understanding that a lot of people won't move forward because it is the funding of last resort, but you want to make sure you've reached as many people as possible, especially with the language barriers and especially at the time of the storm. And so really getting out to people as much as possible. We have a case management system that we put in place that we're hoping will be able to move forward for future disasters, because it really allows, it was built up over time, so it wasn't perfect at the beginning, but it really allows us to manage our whole portfolio, to exchange documentation, to link directly to FEMA and SBA and Department of Buildings and all of these other systems. We need the funding. You know, the funding came to us in a very staggered way, and so there were, it took until 2015 to know that we had the full, to fight for and get the full funding to ensure we could really serve everyone. And then the program really needs to help homeowners make their own choices and maximize customer choice and have them say they want to be reimbursed or they want to be rebuilt. And we were a little bit more prescriptive than it might have worked. And then there's more detailed recommendations. I will say that one of the big steps that we're taking, in addition to wrapping up the program, dealing with the warranty issues and making sure everyone's home, and closing out the construction contracts in the HUD grant, which is a long-term process, is really thinking about how we prepare the city for the future, both in making sure that we can maximize the financial resources for the city and its residents, and ensuring people have flood insurance, and ensuring we know how to deliver benefits in the future and the best way to connect all of these benefits, to accelerate the work that's happening in the neighborhoods and housing resiliency, and doing that in partnership with the Office of Resiliency and city planning and all of the other agencies that are focused on this, and most importantly, to have a maintain operational readiness, that we're prepared for disasters, working in partnership with emergency management and the other agencies. So I think that is the last slide.
Thank you, that was great.
It's good. I would think this program has more emotional issues than the others do, which makes for a lot of difficulty.
Yeah.
Because as you were going through, before you got to the modular housing, I was thinking in a lot of these cases, it would be a lot more simple to rebuild than it would be to do the repair. And that's a kind of a difficult decision going through for a number of reasons. One, for the family, it's their home. Second thing is, I'm sure you don't want to gentrify the neighborhood. But I'm assuming there was a lot of lessons learned in that area.
Very much so. And I think we took over the program in 2014, and I started in end of March, beginning of April. And because the city wasn't kind of prepared for the program, we relied on consultants a lot in 2013. And so a big part of what we did in 2014 was hire people from the communities and actually embed ourselves in elected officials' offices and really try to be more on the ground, because one, they didn't really trust us, and so they needed to have people that they trusted to have that conversation. And so really ensuring that, and we ended up hiring a number of people who participated in the program in some way, and their ability to kind of go out and talk to homeowners about having the patience to go through this process and the end result will be a good result was really important. But the lessons we learned in terms of trying to lift a home that was 80 years old, people had been born in their homes, and generations had lived in their homes, so they didn't want to part with their homes and end up with a new modular home. We also, there was a huge perception that elevation was a lot less expensive than rebuilding a home. But when you have to rebuild it in place because you lifted and it's so structurally.
You rebuild it anyhow.
Yeah, and there were a lot of unforeseen conditions, and that's a struggle, right? Do you go in and do this, really go into people's homes and poke holes in walls and stuff when you're not even sure if they'll be in the program, to make decisions? In one home that we lifted in Far Rockaway, it had had multiple fires in the past. The homeowner who lived there had no idea because they just kind of put sheetrock over the home. So there were a lot of unforeseen conditions that we saw in that regard.
Is there a process in place to institutionalize the knowledge you guys have gained? I mean, I'm hoping there's not going to be another Sandy tomorrow, but at some point in time, there's likely to be something. So how are we planning to maintain the knowledge?
Yeah, so we are in the process of transitioning our office from the Mayor's Office of Housing and Recovery Operations to the Mayor's Office of Recovery Preparedness, focused on exactly those three goals. The Department of City Planning, the Mayor's Office of Resiliency, and HPD and our office meet regularly to talk about the issues that deal with how to best elevate and rebuild homes. We want to be able to continue to provide assistance. We actually were unsuccessful, but applied for a FEMA HMGP grant to try to continue to have funding for people to do work in people's homes, because we also want the contractors to stay in place. We're also meeting with finance and emergency management and other agencies to talk about the flood insurance issues. So our intention is to keep some of the people, especially who have the real knowledge on the benefits and how they all, how you tie the federal benefits together for these individual homeowners in the first place is very complicated, and it needs to be done right. We had the opportunity last week to participate on a call with all of the other states who are dealing with these exact same issues, some obviously more than us, the Carolinas and Louisiana and Texas, and really trying to help FEMA and SBA and HUD have a better continuum of recovery for their programs.
Excuse me, but the three of us are going to have to leave now, and I'm sure Amy will stay here all day answering all these questions. But sorry to bow out, but we got to go over to the city council. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. It was a good presentation.
Good. Well, thank you.
Amy, is there a way that we could get copies of the PowerPoint? There were two other members of the... Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was unexpectedly out for the last 2 days, so I had to do some work this morning.
Disaster recovery?
Although my stove my gas line doesn't work in my apartment anymore, and I feel like it's a little bit of the homeowners have built it back, just trying to, that wasn't why I was out though. Okay. Any other questions?
No.
This might be out of turn, but we love people coming out to see our sites. If you at some point wanted, transparency we have with HUD, we have with other parts of the city. We make this offer to everyone. If you would like to come out and have a tour, we're more than happy to. Now that the weather is looking up, we're more than happy to facilitate that.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I guess that concludes the Audit Committee meeting for today. Motion to adjourn. Thank you.